Have you ever felt like the world is spinning out of control? Like chaos reigns and the forces of darkness are winning? We're about to journey back to a time just like that. A kingdom fractured, kings turning their backs on God, and society teetering on the brink of collapse. But it's in the deepest darkness that light shines the brightest. In this story, we'll witness prophets who command fire from the heavens, an invisible army of angels defending a city, a dead man brought back to life by a touch, and a powerful empire brought to its knees overnight without a single sword being drawn. It's a gripping saga of faith and failure, of divine power and human frailty. And I promise you, the way this epic story concludes is not what you'd expect. It's a quiet, almost hidden detail that holds the key to God's unwavering faithfulness, even in the face of utter disaster. Before we dive into this incredible narrative, I'd love to know where you're joining us from. Take a moment and drop your city or country and the current time in the comments below. It's amazing to see our community gathered from all corners of the globe, united by these timeless stories. All right, find a comfortable spot and let's open the pages to one of the most dramatic periods in all of history. The sacred account of the second book of Kings ushers us into one of the most tumultuous and captivating chapters in the history of the Israelite people. We find ourselves in the aftermath of King Solomon's glorious reign, a period where the unified kingdom tragically fractured, splitting into two separate nations. To the north lay the kingdom of Israel, and to the south, the kingdom of Judah. This profound division was not merely political, it was a schism that tore through the spiritual heart of the nation, unleashing an era of instability, idolatry, and moral decay. Our journey begins in the waning year of this divided kingdom, a pivotal moment as the formidable prophet Elijah, a man who seemed more of heaven than of earth, prepares for his extraordinary departure from this world. His successor, the faithful Elisha, stands ready to inherit his mantle and step onto the center stage of divine history. This is a time of stark contrasts, of kings who brazenly defy the Almighty, and of courageous prophets who speak truth to power, often at the risk of their own lives. It is an age of astonishing miracles, where the veil between heaven and earth seems to grow thin, revealing the unmistakable hand of God moving powerfully amidst the encroaching chaos. It is as if, in anticipation of the coming storms of judgment, God himself was amplifying his presence, making one final dramatic appeal to his wayward people. The first 8 chapters of this remarkable book chronicle a series of breathtaking events, from Elijah's fiery ascent into the heavens to the stunning miracles performed by his successor, Elisha. So let us embark on this exploration together. Let us delve into a narrative overflowing with drama, unwavering faith, and the persistent, comforting reminder that even in the bleakest and most desperate of times, God never, ever abandons his people. Following the death of the infamous King Ahab, his son, Ahaziah, ascended to the throne of Israel. This new monarch tragically chose to walk in the sinful footsteps of his parents, Ahab and Jezebel, continuing their legacy of promoting the worship of the false god, Baal. In the very first chapter of 2 Kings, we are immediately confronted with the consequences of this spiritual rebellion. We learn that King Ahaziah suffered a severe and potentially fatal accident within the confines of his own palace in Samaria. He fell through the lattice of his upper room and was gravely injured. The fall left him bedridden, his future hanging precariously in the balance, uncertain whether he would live or die. In this moment of crisis, a king's true heart is often revealed. Instead of turning to the God of Israel, the one true source of healing and life, Ahaziah made a decision that laid bare the depths of his apostasy. He commanded his messengers, "Go and inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, to see if I will recover from this injury." This choice was a profound betrayal. Here was the king of God's chosen people, placing more faith in a pagan deity of a Philistine city a god whose very name meant Lord of the Flies, than in the Lord who had delivered Israel time and time again. But heaven was watching. An angel of the Lord appeared to Elijah the Tishbite with a stern and urgent command. Go up and meet the messengers of the king of Samaria and ask them, is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore, this is what the Lord says. You will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die. Without hesitation, Elijah obeyed. He intercepted the king's messengers on their journey. After hearing the prophet's severe and divinely inspired message, they were so startled that they immediately abandoned their mission and returned to the palace. The king was taken aback by their swift return. "Why have you come back?" he demanded. Their reply was direct and unsettling. "A man came to meet us," they explained, "and he said to us, 'Go back to the king who sent you and tell him, this is what the Lord says. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are sending men to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore, you will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die.'" Intrigued and perhaps unnerved by this mysterious figure who spoke with such authority, Ahaziah pressed for a description. What kind of man was he who came to meet you and told you this? The description they gave was simple, yet instantly recognizable. He was a man with a garment of hair and with a leather belt around his waist. Recognition dawned on the king's face. That was Elijah the Tishbite, he declared. Here was another moment of decision for the king. Faced with a direct word from God through his most powerful prophet, Ahaziah could have repented. He could have humbled himself and sought the Lord's mercy. Instead, his heart hardened. Consumed by pride and rage, he sought to arrest the prophet of God. He dispatched a captain with a company of 50 men to apprehend Elijah. The captain found the prophet sitting defiantly on top of a hill and with foolish arrogance commanded, "Man of God," the king says, "come down." Elijah's response was a terrifying demonstration of divine power. "If I am a man of God," he declared, "may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Instantly, as the words left his lips, fire blazed from the sky and incinerated the captain and his entire company. Unbelievably, the stubborn King Ahaziah did not learn his lesson. He sent another captain with another 50 men who met the same horrifying fate. It seems almost impossible to comprehend, but the king, blinded by his defiance, dispatched a third group. This time, however, the captain acted with wisdom and humility. He approached Elijah, fell on his knees before him, and pleaded, "Man of God, please have respect for my life and the lives of these 50 of your servants." His humility was honored. The Lord showed mercy. The angel told Elijah, "Go down with him. Do not be afraid of him." So Elijah went down to the king and delivered the final, unalterable message in person. "This is what the Lord says, because you sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, as if there were no God in Israel to inquire of, you will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die." And so it came to pass. Ahaziah died, just as the Lord had spoken through Elijah. Because he had no son to succeed him, his brother Joram became the new king of Israel. Elijah's time on earth was drawing to a close, but his departure would be as extraordinary as his life. The second chapter of 2 Kings opens with this momentous announcement. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Knowing what was about to happen, Elijah attempted to part from his devoted apprentice, Elisha. "Stay here," he said. "The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha, bound by a fierce loyalty, replied, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." His faithfulness revealed the profound father-son bond that had grown between them. At Bethel, a company of prophets approached Elisha and asked, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," Elisha replied, "but do not speak of it." He was guarding this sacred, painful moment in his heart. Again, Elijah tried to go on alone, first to Jericho and then to the Jordan River, but each time Elisha refused to leave his side, repeating his vow of loyalty. As they reached the Jordan, 50 men from the company of prophets stood at a distance, watching. At the riverbank, Elijah performed a final, powerful miracle. He took off his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water. Immediately, the waters of the Jordan parted to the right and to the left, and the two men crossed over on dry ground. This miracle was a powerful echo of the great crossings led by Moses at the Red Sea and Joshua at this very same river, signifying that the same God was at work through Elijah. On the other side, Elijah turned to his faithful student. "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha's response was not for wealth or fame. It revealed the deep spiritual yearning of his heart. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," he requested. This wasn't a request for twice Elijah's power, but rather the inheritance of a firstborn son, the right to be recognized as the primary heir and successor to his spiritual father's ministry. Elijah replied, "You have asked a difficult thing, yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." As they were walking and talking, an astonishing event unfolded. Suddenly, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha, witnessing this incredible sight, cried out in anguish and awe, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." In his grief, he tore his own clothes, a sign of mourning. As Elijah disappeared from view, his cloak fell to the ground. Elisha picked it up and returned to the bank of the Jordan. There, in a test of faith, he took the cloak, struck the water, and cried out, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" Once again, the water divided, and Elisha crossed back over. The prophets who had been watching from a distance declared, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." They bowed down before him, acknowledging him as their new prophetic leader. Even after witnessing his ascension, some of the prophets insisted on searching for Elijah's body for 3 days. But just as Elisha had told them, they found nothing. God had truly taken Elijah into his heavenly presence. With Elijah's cloak on his shoulders, a symbol of his new authority, Elisha began his own prophetic ministry. His first public miracle involved water, a vital element in the arid lands of Israel. In the city of Jericho, there was a serious problem. The men of the city said to Elisha, "As you can see, this town is well situated, but the water is bad and the land is unproductive." The city's water source was contaminated, causing the land to be barren and miscarriages to be common. Elisha's solution was simple yet symbolic. "Bring me a new bowl," he said, "and put salt in it." When they brought it to him, Elisha went to the spring, threw the salt into it, and declared, "This is what the Lord says, I have healed this water. Never again will it cause death or barrenness." The result was immediate and lasting, and the water has remained pure to this day, according to the word Elisha had spoken. Soon after, Elisha became involved in a military campaign. Joram, king of Israel, along with Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and the king of Edom, marched against the nation of Moab, which had rebelled. After a 7-day march through the desert, they faced a critical problem. There was no water for the army or their animals. The king of Israel saw this as a sign of doom. But the faithful King Jehoshaphat asked, "Is there no prophet of the Lord here, through whom we may inquire of the Lord?" An officer reported that Elisha was present. The 3 kings went to see Elisha, who at first showed contempt for the idolatrous king of Israel. "What do we have in common? Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother." But out of respect for the godly King Jehoshaphat, Elisha agreed to help. To prepare himself to receive a word from God, Elisha requested, "Bring me a harpist." As the harpist played, the hand of the Lord came upon Elisha. He gave a strange instruction, "Make this valley full of ditches." He then explained the miracle that was to come. You will see neither wind nor rain, yet this valley will be filled with water, and you, your cattle, and your other animals will drink. He also prophesied victory over Moab. The next morning, water flowed from the direction of Edom and filled the valley. This miracle not only saved the army from thirst, but also paved the way for their victory. When the Moabites saw the sun reflecting on the water, it looked red like blood. Thinking the allied kings had fought among themselves, they charged into the Israelite camp to plunder it, only to be met by a refreshed and ready army that routed them completely. Elisha's ministry was not confined to grand national affairs. He often used his gifts to help ordinary people, demonstrating that God cares as much for the small, personal struggles of individuals as he does for the great matters of state. A poignant example is the story of a widow who came to Elisha in a desperate situation. Her husband, who had been one of the prophets, had died and left behind a crushing debt. Now, the creditor was coming to take her 2 sons as slaves to settle the account. "Your servant, my husband, is dead," she explained, "and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves." Elisha asked her what she had in her house. She replied, "Your servant has nothing there at all except a small jar of olive oil." With this humble resource, Elisha saw the potential for a miracle. He instructed her, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars." The widow obeyed. She collected as many jars as she could find and began to pour. Miraculously, the oil kept flowing until every single vessel was full. When she told Elisha, he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." A second story tells of a wealthy Shunammite woman. Whenever Elisha passed through her town, she would insist that he stop for a meal. Recognizing that he was a holy man of God, she and her husband built a small room for him on their roof. Elisha, wanting to repay her kindness, asked his servant Gehazi what could be done for her. Gehazi observed, "She has no son, and her husband is old." In Israelite culture, to be childless was a great sorrow. Elisha called the woman and made a promise. "About this time next year you will hold a son in your arms." Her response was one of disbelieving hope. "No, my lord, please, man of God, don't mislead your servant." But just as Elisha had said, the woman conceived and gave birth to a son the following year. Years later, tragedy struck. The boy suddenly became ill while out in the field. My head," he cried. He was carried to his mother, sat on her lap until noon, and then died. The Shunammite woman did not give in to despair. She laid the boy's body on Elisha's bed and rushed to Mount Carmel to find the prophet. When she found him, she clung to his feet in anguish. Elisha sent Gehazi ahead with his staff to lay on the boy's face, but nothing happened. When Elisha arrived, he went into the room alone, prayed to the Lord, and stretched himself out on the child, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. The boy's body began to grow warm. Elisha got up, walked around the room, and then stretched himself out on the child again. This time, the boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha called the mother and said, "Take your son." She fell at his feet in gratitude, picked up her son, and left. Among all of Elisha's miracles, the healing of Naaman stands out as one of the most significant. In chapter 5, we meet Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, for through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy, a successful man with a devastating problem. Leprosy was a terrifying, incurable disease in the ancient world, leading to physical decay and social isolation. His path to healing began in an unexpected way. A young Israelite girl who had been captured in a raid and now served Naaman's wife said, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." This simple testimony of faith reached Naaman, who told the king of Aram. The king sent Naaman to Israel with a letter and expensive gifts: 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of fine clothing. The letter read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." The king of Israel saw this as a political provocation. "Am I God?" he cried. "Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy?" In his distress, he tore his robes. When Elisha heard about the king's reaction, he sent a message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." Naaman arrived at Elisha's house with his impressive entourage of horses and chariots. Instead of meeting him personally, Elisha sent a messenger with a simple, almost insulting instruction: "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." Naaman was furious. "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel?" His servants, however, wisely advised him, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" Naaman humbled himself and decided to obey. He went down to the Jordan River and dipped himself 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. The healing was complete and instantaneous. Overwhelmed, Naaman returned to Elisha to express his gratitude. "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel." Naaman tried to give Elisha a gift, but the prophet steadfastly refused. Before leaving, Naaman made a unique request: "Please let me be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord." He wanted to take a piece of Israel's soil with him, to build an altar to the God of Israel in his own homeland. Elisha was more than a performer of personal miracles. He also played a vital role in Israel's national security. He supernaturally knew the enemy's military plans and warned the king. Chapter 6 recounts, "Now the king of Aram was at war with Israel. After conferring with his officers, he said, 'I will set up my camp in such and such a place.' The man of God sent word to the king of Israel, 'Beware of passing that place, because the Arameans are going down there.' This ability repeatedly thwarted the Aramean king's plans. So the king of Israel checked on the place indicated by the man of God. Time and again Elisha warned the king. The king of Aram, suspecting a traitor in his ranks, demanded of his officers, 'Tell me, which of us is on the side of the king of Israel?' One of them replied, 'None of us, my lord the king.' But Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom." Determined to capture Elisha, the king discovered he was in Dothan and sent horses, chariots, and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. The next morning, Elisha's servant saw the army and panicked. "Oh no, my lord, what shall we do?" Elisha's answer revealed a profound spiritual reality. "Don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. As the Aramean army advanced, Elisha prayed, "Strike this army with blindness." And the Lord struck them blind. Elisha then told them, "This is not the road, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will lead you to the man you are looking for." He led them directly into Samaria, the capital of Israel. Once they arrived, Elisha prayed for the Lord to open their eyes again. The Aramean soldiers were stunned to realize they were in the middle of their enemy's capital, completely vulnerable. The king of Israel asked Elisha, "Shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them?" Elisha, showing incredible mercy, replied, "Do not kill them. Would you kill those you have captured with your own sword or bow? Set food and water before them so that they may eat and drink and then go back to their master." The result of this merciful strategy was astonishing. He prepared a great feast for them, and after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away, and they returned to their master. So the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory. But peace did not last forever. Sometime later, Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, laid siege to Samaria. The siege was so severe that it caused a horrific famine in the city. Chapter 6 describes the desperate situation. A donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver, and a quarter of a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels. The hunger became so extreme that unthinkable acts occurred. As the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried out to him, "Help me, my lord, the king." When he asked what was wrong, she told a horrifying story. "This woman said to me, 'Give up your son so we may eat him today, and tomorrow we'll eat my son.' So we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I said to her, 'Give up your son so we may eat him,' but she had hidden him." Horrified, the king tore his robes in anguish. Underneath, he was wearing sackcloth, a sign of mourning and repentance that the people could not see. But instead of turning to God, the king blamed Elisha and vowed to kill him. "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if the head of Elisha son of Shaphat remains on his shoulders today." While Elisha was at his house with the elders of Israel, the king sent an executioner. But Elisha knew he was coming before he arrived. "Look, this murderer is sending someone to cut off my head. When the messenger comes, shut the door and hold it fast against him. Is not the sound of his master's footsteps behind him?" While he was still speaking, the messenger arrived, followed by the king himself, who declared, "This disaster is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" At that critical moment of despair, Elisha made an astounding promise. "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow, a seah of the finest flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." The king's officer scoffed. "Look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of the heavens, could this happen?" Elisha replied, "You will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat any of it." That night, something extraordinary happened. 4 lepers living outside the city gate decided to surrender to the Arameans. "If we stay here, we will die. If we go into the city, the famine is there and we will die. Let's go over to the camp of the Arameans and surrender. If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, then we die." At dusk, they went to the Aramean camp and found it completely deserted. The Lord had caused the Aramean army to hear the sound of chariots and horses, and a great army, so they had fled at twilight, abandoning their tents, horses, and donkeys. They ran for their lives. The lepers entered one of the tents and ate and drank, taking silver, gold, and clothes. Then they realized their responsibility. "We're not doing right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves." They returned to the city and reported the miraculous flight of the Arameans. The king, suspecting a trap, sent out scouts to investigate. They confirmed that the Arameans had indeed fled, leaving behind clothing and equipment all along the road. The people of Samaria rushed out and plundered the Aramean camp, and Elisha's prophecy was fulfilled. Food was abundant and cheap again. And what of the officer who had doubted? The king put him in charge of the gate, but he was trampled to death by the crowd, just as the man of God had foretold. The story of the Shunammite woman did not end with the resurrection of her son. In chapter 8, we see God's continued care for her years later. Elisha had warned her, "Go, you and your family, and stay for a while wherever you can, because the Lord has decreed a famine in the land that will last 7 years." She obeyed and went to live in the land of the Philistines for the duration of the famine. When she returned, she faced a problem. Her house and land had been taken during her absence. Determined to reclaim what was hers, She went to the king to appeal for her property. By a remarkable coincidence, at that very moment, Gehazi, Elisha's servant, was telling the king about the great miracles his master had performed. He said, "This is the woman, my lord the king, and this is her son whom Elisha restored to life." The king asked the woman about it, and she confirmed everything. Amazed by her story and moved by God's care for her, the king made a generous decision: give back everything that belonged to her, including all the income from her land from the day she left the country until now. Thus, through a remarkable divine intervention, the woman not only recovered her property, but also received all the profits it had generated during her 7-year absence. What might have seemed a financial loss due to her obedience to the prophet was more than richly compensated. This story closes the cycle of miracles related to the Shunammite woman and shows how God rewards faith and obedience. First, she received a son when she least expected it. Then, the child was restored to life after his death. And finally, her land was restored when it seemed lost forever. At every stage, God demonstrated his faithful care. While Joram, son of Ahab, was reigning in Israel, the prophet Elisha summoned one of the young prophets and gave him a special mission. In the 9th chapter of 2 Kings, we see Elisha sending this young man with clear instructions. In verses 1 to 3, he says, "Take this flask of oil with you and go at once to Ramoth Gilead. When you get there, look for Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi. Go to him, get him away from his companions and take him into an inner room. Then take the flask and pour the oil on his head and declare, 'This is what the Lord says. I anoint you king over Israel.' Then open the door and run, don't delay." The young prophet obeyed and set off to fulfill his mission. When he arrived at Ramoth Gilead, he found the army commanders assembled. In verse 5, he says, "I have a message for you, commander." Jehu asked, "For which of us?" And the young man replied, "For you, commander." Jehu got up and they went into a private room. There, as verse 6 recounts, the prophet poured the oil on Jehu's head and declared, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anoint you king over the Lord's people, Israel." This anointing was not just a political act, it was a divine commission. In verses 7 to 10, the prophet continued, "You are to destroy the house of Ahab, your master, and I will avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all the Lord's servants shed by Jezebel. The whole house of Ahab will perish. I will cut off from Ahab every last male in Israel, slave or free. I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, son of Ahijah. As for Jezebel, dogs will devour her on the plot of ground at Jezreel, and no one will bury her." After delivering this message, the young prophet opened the door and fled, just as Elisha had instructed. When Jehu returned to the other commanders, they were curious. In verse 11, they asked, "Is everything all right? What did this madman want with you?" Jehu tried to brush it off. "You know what kind of man he is and the things he says." But they were not convinced and kept pressing. "That's not true. Tell us what he said." Then in verse 12, Jehu revealed, "He said to me, 'This is what the Lord says. I anoint you king over Israel.'" The reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Verse 13 describes how they responded. They hurried and took their cloaks and spread them on the bare steps before Jehu. Then they blew the trumpet and shouted, "Jehu is king." This spontaneous declaration confirmed Jehu's authority and set the stage for his rebellion against the royal house. Without delay, Jehu got in his chariot and set off for Jezreel, where King Joram was recovering from wounds sustained in battle. Jehu's driving style was so distinctive that the watchmen in Jezreel could recognize him from a distance. In verse 20, the watchman reported, "The messenger has reached them, but he isn't coming back." The driving is like that of Jehu, son of Nimshi. He drives like a madman. The decisive confrontation took place at the very vineyard that had once belonged to Naboth, whom Ahab and Jezebel had murdered years before. When Joram met Jehu, he asked, "Have you come in peace, Jehu?" The response was devastating. In verse 22, Jehu declared, "How can there be peace as long as all the idolatry and witchcraft of your mother, Jezebel, abound?" Sensing the danger, Joram tried to flee, shouting to Ahaziah, "Treachery, Ahaziah!" But it was too late. In verse 24, Jehu drew his bow and shot Joram between the shoulders. The arrow pierced his heart, and he slumped dead in his chariot. Joram's death was just the beginning of Jehu's vengeance. He ordered the body to be thrown into the field of Naboth, fulfilling the prophecy that Ahab's family would be punished in that very spot. Then Jehu pursued and killed Ahaziah, king of Judah, who was visiting Joram. The most gruesome fate, however, was reserved for Jezebel. When Jehu arrived in Jezreel, Jezebel put on her makeup, did her hair, and looked out a palace window. In verse 30, she taunted him, "Have you come in peace, you Zimri, you murderer of your master?" But Jehu was unmoved. He looked up and shouted, "Who is on my side? Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down at him, and Jehu commanded, "Throw her down." They threw her to the ground, and her blood splattered on the wall and on the horses. After going inside to eat and drink, Jehu gave an order to bury Jezebel, saying in verse 34, "Take care of that cursed woman and bury her, for she was a king's daughter." But when they went to bury her, all they found were her skull, her feet, and her hands. The rest had been eaten by dogs, just as the prophet Elijah had foretold years earlier. After the deaths of Joram and Jezebel, Jehu turned his attention to the rest of Ahab's family. 70 sons of Ahab were living in Samaria under the care of the city leaders. In chapter 10, Jehu sent a letter to these leaders, challenging them to choose one of Ahab's sons as king and fight him. In verse 4, we see how terrified the leaders were. 2 kings could not resist him. How can we? So they sent this reply to Jehu, "We are your servants and will do anything you say. We will not appoint anyone as king. Do whatever you think best." Jehu sent a second letter demanding proof of their loyalty. "If you are on my side and will obey me," he wrote, "bring me the heads of your master's sons at Jezreel by this time tomorrow." The next day, the leaders of Samaria killed all 70 of Ahab's sons and sent their heads in baskets to Jehu in Jezreel. When the heads were delivered, Jehu ordered them to be piled in 2 heaps at the city gate until morning. The next day, he addressed the people in verse 9, saying, "You are innocent. It was I who conspired against my master and killed him, but who killed all these?" With these cunning words, Jehu made it clear that the prophecy against the house of Ahab was being fulfilled. The Lord has done what he promised through his servant Elijah. Jehu did not stop there. He killed all who were left of Ahab's family in Jezreel, including his officials, close friends, and priests. He left no one alive, completely fulfilling the prophecy against the house of Ahab. But the most cunning part of Jehu's plan was yet to come. After securing his power, he made a bold declaration in verse 18, "Ahab served Baal a little. Jehu will serve him much." This seemed to suggest that Jehu was an even more devoted worshiper of Baal than his predecessor. To prove this devotion, Jehu called for a great assembly to honor Baal. Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu will serve him much. Now summon all the prophets of Baal, all his ministers, and all his priests. See that no one is missing, because I am going to hold a great sacrifice for Baal. Anyone who fails to attend will not live. Verses 19 to 21 show how Jehu used every deception to gather all the Baal worshippers. He proclaimed a solemn assembly for Baal, and they did so. Jehu sent word throughout Israel, and all the servants of Baal came, not one stayed away. They crowded into the temple of Baal until it was full from one end to the other. Before the ceremony began, Jehu took precautions to ensure that only Baal worshippers were present. In verse 22, he ordered the keeper of the wardrobe, "Bring out robes for all the servants of Baal." Once they were all dressed in their ritual garments, Jehu and Jehonadab, son of Rechab, entered the temple. Jehu warned them in verse 23, "Make sure there are no servants of the Lord here with you, but only servants of Baal." This gave any faithful Israelites a chance to escape, but also ensured that only true followers of Baal remained. As the sacrifices began, Jehu positioned 80 of his men outside and instructed, "If one of you lets any of the men I am placing in your hands escape, it will be your life for his life." As soon as he finished making the offering, Jehu gave the order in verse 25, "Go in and kill them, let no one escape." The soldiers moved in and cut them all down with the sword. Then they dragged out the sacred pillar from the temple of Baal and burned it. They demolished the sacred stone and tore down the temple itself, converting it into a latrine, a purpose it still served at the time this text was written. Thus, with this bloody cunning, Jehu wiped out the worship of Baal from Israel. In verse 28 we read, "So Jehu destroyed Baal worship in Israel." While these dramatic events were unfolding in the northern kingdom, another tragedy was taking place in Judah. When Ahaziah, king of Judah, was killed by Jehu, his mother Athaliah saw an opportunity to seize power for herself. In chapter 11, verse 1, we see Athaliah's ruthless act. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole royal family. Athaliah was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, and the wife of the late king Jehoram of Judah. Now that her son Ahaziah was dead, she was determined to eliminate any other heirs to the throne and rule alone. This massacre nearly wiped out the entire royal line of David, which would have been a spiritual and historical disaster for Israel. But providentially, one brave person stepped in to save a single surviving heir. In verse 2, we see how Jehosheba, Ahaziah's sister and the daughter of King Jehoram, but by a different mother than Athaliah, acted swiftly and wisely. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram and sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the royal princes who were about to be murdered. She put him and his nurse in a bedroom to hide him from Athaliah, so he was not killed. Joash was just an infant when he was rescued by his aunt Jehosheba, who was the wife of the high priest Jehoiada. Verse 3 tells us he remained hidden with his nurse at the temple of the Lord for 6 years while Athaliah ruled the land. For 6 long years, Athaliah ruled Judah, unaware that the rightful heir of the house of David was alive and sheltered within the temple precincts. She promoted the worship of Baal in Judah, following in the footsteps of her parents, Ahab and Jezebel. A temple to Baal was built in Jerusalem, while the true worship of the Lord was neglected. This was one of the darkest periods in Judah's history. The line of David through which the Messiah was to come was hanging by a single thread represented by a hidden child. But God remained faithful to his promise to David, preserving the young Joash so that at the appointed time he could be rightfully installed on the throne. After 6 years under the tyrannical rule of Athaliah, the high priest Jehoiada decided it was time to restore the throne to the legitimate Davidic line. In chapter 11, verse 4, we see how he carefully planned the restoration. In the 7th year, Jehoiada sent for the commanders of units of 100, the Carites and the guards, and had them brought to him at the temple of the Lord. He made a covenant with them and put them under oath at the temple of the Lord. Then he showed them the king's son. Jehoiada divided the soldiers into 3 groups, as seen in verses 5 to 8. He instructed them in detail. 1/3 of you who are going on duty on the Sabbath are to keep watch at the royal palace, 1/3 at the Sur gate, and 1/3 at the gate behind the guard, who take turns guarding the temple. And the other 2 companies of you who are normally off duty on the Sabbath are all to guard the temple for the king. Stand around the king, each man with his weapon in his hand. Anyone who approaches your ranks is to be put to death. Stay close to the king wherever he goes. The soldiers would form a human shield around the young king, weapons in hand, ready to kill anyone who tried to harm him. They were to accompany him wherever he went. On the appointed day, the commanders did exactly as Jehoiada had instructed. Verse 9 reads, "The commanders of the units of 100 did just as Jehoiada the priest ordered. Each one took his men, those who were going on duty on the Sabbath and those who were going off duty, and came to Jehoiada the priest. To arm the guards, Jehoiada gave them the spears and shields that had once belonged to King David and were stored in the temple of the Lord." Verse 11 describes the scene. The guards, each with his weapon in his hand, stationed themselves around the king, near the altar and the temple, from the south side to the north side of the temple. Then came the solemn moment of the coronation. In verse 12 we read, "Jehoiada brought out the king's son and put the crown on him. He presented him with a copy of the covenant and proclaimed him king. They anointed him, and the people clapped their hands and shouted, 'Long live the king!' When the usurper Athaliah heard the noise, she came to the temple to see what was happening. Her horrified reaction is recorded in verse 14. She looked, and there was the king standing by the pillar, as the custom was. The officers and the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Then Athaliah tore her robes and cried out, 'Treason! Treason!' The high priest Jehoiada ordered Athaliah to be taken out of the temple and executed. Verse 16 tells us, "So they seized her as she reached the place where the horses enter the palace grounds, and there she was put to death." After Athaliah's execution, Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord, the king, and the people, binding them as the Lord's people. He also made a covenant between the king and the people. Verse 17 reads, "Jehoiada then made a covenant between the Lord and the king, and people that they would be the Lord's people. He also made a covenant between the king and the people. Then all the people went to the temple of Baal and tore it down. They smashed the altars and idols to pieces and killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altars. Finally, Jehoiada and the people brought King Joash from the temple to the royal palace, escorted by the guards. Joash took his place on the royal throne, and all the people of the land rejoiced. The city was calm because Athaliah had been put to death with the sword at the palace." Verse 21 concludes this dramatic episode with a simple but powerful statement. Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign. A 7-year-old boy now sat on the throne of David, preserving the messianic line and restoring true worship in Judah. Returning to the northern kingdom, Jehu received divine praise for destroying Ahab's dynasty. In chapter 10, verse 30, the Lord said to Jehu, "Because you have done well in executing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab all I had in mind to do, your descendants will sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation." This promise was fulfilled, as Jehu's dynasty lasted for 5 generations. Jehu, Jehoahaz, Jehoash, Jeroboam II, and Zechariah. However, despite eradicating Baal worship, Jehu was not completely faithful to the Lord. Verse 29 states, "However, he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit, the worship of the golden calves at Bethel and Dan." Jehu had eliminated one form of idolatry only to maintain another. These golden calves had been set up by the first king of Israel, Jeroboam, to prevent the people from going to worship in Jerusalem. This idolatry remained the official state religion of the northern kingdom for its entire history. Because of this partial faithfulness, the Lord began to reduce the territory of Israel. As verse 32 says, "In those days the Lord began to reduce the size of Israel. Hazael overpowered the Israelites throughout their territory. The powerful Syrian king Hazael conquered all of Israel's land east of the Jordan River in the regions of Gilead and Bashan. After reigning for 28 years, Jehu died and was succeeded by his son Jehoahaz. Verse 35 records, Jehu rested with his ancestors and was buried in Samaria, and Jehoahaz his son succeeded him as king. The reign of Jehoahaz from 814 to 798 BC was marked by numerous military defeats and oppression by the Syrians. In chapter 13, verse 3, we read, "So the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and for a long time he kept them under the power of Hazael, king of Aram, and Ben-Hadad his son." The situation became so desperate that in verse 7, it says, "Nothing had been left of the army of Jehoahaz, but 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 foot soldiers, for the king of Aram had destroyed the rest and made them like the dust at threshing time." In his desperation, Jehoahaz turned to the Lord. In verse 4 we read, "Then Jehoahaz sought the Lord's favor, and the Lord listened to him, for he saw how severely the king of Aram was oppressing Israel. The Lord, in his mercy, sent a savior to Israel, who delivered them from Syrian oppression." After Jehoahaz, his son Jehoash became king in 798 BC. He continued the idolatrous practices of his predecessors. In verse 11 we read, "He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and did not turn away from any of the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. He continued in them." However, Jehoash did achieve some military victories against Syria. Before his death, the prophet Elisha predicted that Jehoash would defeat the Syrians 3 times. In verses 18 and 19, Elisha instructed Jehoash to take some arrows and strike the ground with them. Jehoash struck the ground 3 times and then stopped. Elisha was angry and said, "You should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed it. But now you will defeat it only 3 times." Indeed, in verse 25 we read, "Then Jehoash son of Jehoahaz recaptured from Ben-Hadad son of Hazael the towns he had taken in battle from his father Jehoahaz. 3 times Jehoash defeated him, and so he recovered the Israelite towns." During the reign of Jehoash's son, Jeroboam II, 793 to 753 BC, Israel experienced a period of great prosperity and territorial expansion. However, his son Zechariah was the last of Jehu's line to reign. His reign lasted only 6 months before he was assassinated by Shallum, fulfilling the Lord's promise that Jehu's descendants would reign to the 4th generation. During the reigns of Jehoahaz and Jehoash, Elisha continued his prophetic ministry, influencing the political affairs of Israel and proclaiming the word of the Lord. In chapter 13, verse 14, we find that Elisha was old and ill. Now Elisha was suffering from the illness from which he died. Jehoash, king of Israel, went down to see him and wept over him. My father, he cried, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." Even on his deathbed, Elisha had one last prophetic message to deliver. He instructed King Jehoash to open the window eastward toward Syria and shoot an arrow. As the king did so, Elisha declared in verse 17, "The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram. You will completely destroy the Arameans at Aphek." Then, as mentioned, Elisha told the king to strike the ground with the arrows. The king struck 3 times and stopped. Elisha was angry with the king for stopping, explaining that now he would only defeat Syria 3 times instead of achieving a complete victory. Verse 20 records Elisha's death. Elisha died and was buried. But even after his death, God's power continued to be manifest through him. A remarkable story is told in verses 20 and 21. Now Moabite raiders used to enter the country every spring. Once, while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders. So they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. This posthumous miracle served as a powerful reminder of the divine power that had worked through Elisha during his lifetime. It also symbolized the hope that even in a time of invasion and instability, God's life-giving power was still present in Israel. After the death of Zechariah, the last king of Jehu's dynasty, Israel entered a period of extreme political instability. In a span of about 30 years, 6 kings sat on the throne, most of whom came to power through conspiracies and assassinations. Shallum, son of Jabesh, assassinated Zechariah and took the throne, but he reigned for only 1 month in Samaria. In chapter 15, verse 14, we read, "Then Menahem, son of Gadi, went up from Tirzah to Samaria. He attacked Shallum, son of Jabesh, in Samaria, killed him, and succeeded him as king. Menahem ruled for 10 years, 752–742 BC, but his reign was marked by extreme cruelty. When the city of Tifsah refused to open its gates to him, he attacked the city and ripped open all its pregnant women. During his reign, Assyria began to threaten Israel. In verse 19 we read, "Then Pul, king of Assyria, invaded the land, and Menahem gave him 1,000 talents of silver to gain his support and strengthen his own hold on the kingdom." To raise this enormous sum, Menahem imposed a heavy tax of 50 shekels of silver on all the wealthy men of Israel. After Menahem, his son Pekahiah reigned for 2 years until he was assassinated by one of his officials, Pekah, son of Remaliah, who conspired against him with 50 men from Gilead. In verse 25, we read that Pekah entered the citadel of the royal palace in Samaria with Argob and Ariah. With 50 men from Gilead, he assassinated Pekahiah and succeeded him as king. Pekah reigned for 20 years, 752–732 BC, and during his reign, the Assyrian threat grew even greater. In verse 29, we read, "In the time of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and took Ijon, Abel-Beth-Makkah, Genoa, Kadesh, and Hazor. He took Gilead and Galilee, including all the land of Naphtali, and deported the people to Assyria." This was the first large-scale deportation of Israelites to Assyria, a dark foreshadowing of what was to come. Finally, Hoshea, son of Elah, conspired against Pekah and assassinated him, becoming the last king of Israel. In verse 30, we read, "Then Hoshea, son of Elah, conspired against Pekah, son of Remaliah. He attacked and assassinated him, and then succeeded him as king. Hoshea reigned for 9 years, 732–722 BC, and it was during his reign that the northern kingdom met its final catastrophic end." Hoshea's reign marked the death throes of the kingdom of Israel. In chapter 17, verse 3, we read, "Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hoshea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute." This vassal relationship with Assyria seemed to offer a degree of protection for the weakened northern kingdom. However, Hoshea made the fatal mistake of trying to break free from Assyrian domination. Verse 4 reveals his desperate gamble, but the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Hoshea sought an alliance with Egypt to help him rebel against Assyria and had stopped paying the required tribute. Shalmaneser's response was swift and brutal. Still in verse 4 we read, "Therefore the king of Assyria seized him and put him in prison." With the king captured, the way was open for a full-scale conquest of Israel. Verse 5 describes the beginning of the end. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. Samaria, the well-fortified capital of Israel, held out for 3 long, desperate years. Finally, in verse 6, we witness the tragic conclusion. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. That year was approximately 722 BC, marking the end of the Northern Kingdom after more than 200 years as an independent nation. The Assyrians were known for their policy of mass deportation, moving conquered populations far from their homelands to break their resistance and prevent future rebellions. Verse 6 continues with the fate of the exiled Israelites. He settled them in Hala, in Gozan, on the Harbor River, and in the towns of the Medes. This practice of forced relocation served a dual purpose. It weakened the national identity of conquered peoples and created mixed communities that were easier to control. For the Israelites, this event marked the beginning of a diaspora that scattered the 10 northern tribes so widely that they came to be known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The biblical account does not merely record these historical events. It also provides a theological explanation for Israel's fall. Verse 7 begins a long reflection. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods. The list of sins continues in the following verses. Idolatry, adopting the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out, building pagan shrines in every town, setting up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill, burning incense on all the high places, and doing all sorts of evil things that aroused the Lord's anger despite his repeated warnings. Perhaps the saddest part is found in verse 14, which sums up the people's attitude. But they would not listen and were as stiff-necked as their ancestors, who did not trust in the Lord their God. Verse 15 adds, they rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors and the statutes he had warned them to keep. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. The culmination of this theological indictment is found in verse 18. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left. To repopulate the now empty land, the Assyrian king brought in people from other conquered regions. In verse 24 we read, the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. These foreign settlers brought their own gods and religious practices. When they began to be attacked by lions, they assumed it was a sign that they did not know how to worship the God of the land. The Assyrian king then sent one of the exiled Israelite priests back to teach them how to worship the Lord. The result, however, was a syncretistic religion. As we see in verse 33, they worshipped the Lord, but they also served their own gods, in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. These mixed peoples, who worshipped a mixture of gods, would later become known as the Samaritans, despised by the Jews of the south for their mixed ancestry and syncretistic religion. The account ends with a grim observation in verses 34 and 41. To this day they persist in their former practices. They neither worship the Lord nor adhere to the decrees and regulations. Even while these people were worshiping the Lord, they were serving their idols. To this day, their children and grandchildren continue to do as their ancestors did. Thus ended the northern kingdom of Israel. The 10 tribes were scattered among the nations, losing their distinct identity and never returning to the promised land as a unified people. Only the southern kingdom of Judah remained as the bearer of the divine promises and the guardian of the messianic line. The fall of Israel serves as a solemn warning about the consequences of persistent unfaithfulness to God. For generations, the Lord had sent prophets to call the people back to the covenant, but they refused to listen. The patience of God, though long, finally gave way to judgment. The Assyrian conquest was not merely a political or military event. It was the fulfillment of divine warnings that dated back to the time of Moses, when he warned of the consequences of disobedience, including exile from the promised land. While the northern kingdom was living out its final days, something extraordinary was happening in Judah, the southern kingdom. In 2 Kings chapter 18, we are introduced to a young king who would change the course of his nation's history. Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign in the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. 2 Kings 18, 1-2. Unlike so many of his predecessors, Hezekiah chose a radically different path. Verse 3 tells us he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. This simple statement marks a pivotal turning point in the history of Judah. After a succession of kings who had done evil in the sight of the Lord, a ruler had finally emerged who was determined to follow the path of David. Hezekiah wasted no time. As soon as he ascended the throne, he initiated profound reforms in the worship of Judah. In verse 4, we see the extent of these changes. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made. For up to that time, the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. This action was truly remarkable. The bronze serpent held a significant place in Israel's history. Back in the time of Moses, when venomous snakes attacked the people in the wilderness, God had instructed Moses to make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. Anyone who looked at it would be healed. It was a legitimate symbol of God's salvation. But now, nearly 700 years later, that object had become an idol. The people had begun to worship the object itself instead of the God it represented. Hezekiah courageously destroyed even this historic artifact when he recognized it had become a spiritual stumbling block. This demonstrated his deep determination to eradicate all forms of idolatry, even those that had a historically or religiously justifiable origin. Hezekiah's faith was extraordinary. In verse 5, the Bible makes a striking statement. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. This high praise places Hezekiah in a unique category, even among the righteous kings of Judah. His devotion to the Lord was not just a matter of sentiment, it was expressed in concrete obedience. Verse 6 continues, he held fast to the Lord and did not stop following him. He kept the commands the Lord had given Moses. Hezekiah went back to the original source of Israel's faith, the law of Moses. Instead of following the corrupted traditions that had developed over time, he sought to re-establish worship according to divine standards. The result of this faithfulness was God's blessing. In verses 7 and 8, we read, "And the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. From watchtower to fortified city, he defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory." This rebellion against Assyria was a bold move. Assyria was the superpower of the day, and few dared to challenge its might. But Hezekiah's confidence was not in human strength. It was in the power of God. His religious reforms were accompanied by significant political and military decisions that helped Judah regain a measure of its independence and national dignity. While Hezekiah was implementing his reforms, a catastrophic event was unfolding nearby: the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. In chapter 18, verse 9, we read, "In King Hezekiah's 4th year, which was the 7th year of Hoshea son of Elah, king of Israel, Shalmaneser king of Assyria marched against Samaria and laid siege to it." This event must have had a profound impact on Judah. From the perspective of Jerusalem, watching Samaria, the capital of their sister kingdom, being besieged by the Assyrians, would have caused deep alarm and anxiety. Verses 10 and 11 continue the story. At the end of 3 years, the Assyrians took it. So Samaria was captured in Hezekiah's 6th year, which was the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel. the king of Assyria deported Israel to Assyria and settled them in Hala, in Gozan on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. As the people of Israel were led into exile, the people of Judah witnessed the fulfillment of the prophetic warnings that had been proclaimed for generations. Verse 12 gives the theological reason for this tragedy. This happened because they had not obeyed the Lord their God, but had violated his covenant, all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded. They neither listened to the commands nor carried them out. For Hezekiah and the people of Judah, the fall of Samaria served as a powerful object lesson. The destruction of their northern relatives confirmed the consequences of disobedience and idolatry. As the Israelites marched into exile, Judah faced a clear choice: follow the same path of rebellion or learn from their brothers' downfall. The contrast between the two kingdoms became increasingly stark. While Israel under Hoshea was reaping the consequences of generations of rebellion, Judah under Hezekiah was experiencing a period of spiritual renewal and reform. Hezekiah seized this critical moment to further consolidate his religious reforms. The devastation of the northern kingdom underscored the urgency and importance of purging idolatry and restoring true worship in Judah. For those who witnessed their neighbors being led away as captives, the connection between obedience to God and national survival became painfully clear. Despite his religious reforms, Hezekiah knew that the Assyrian threat still loomed. Assyria had just conquered the northern kingdom and would soon turn its attention to Judah. In verse 13, we see this threat becoming a reality. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. In the face of this onslaught, Hezekiah took practical steps to fortify Jerusalem. Although the book of 2 Kings does not detail all these preparations, we know from some chronicles and archaeological discoveries that Hezekiah reinforced the walls of Jerusalem and undertook a remarkable engineering project to secure the city's water supply in case of a siege. One of Hezekiah's most impressive achievements was the construction of the tunnel that now bears his name. This tunnel, carved through solid rock, diverted water from the Gihon spring to inside the city walls, to the pool of Siloam. At 533 meters, about 1,750 feet long, it was a masterpiece of ancient engineering, especially considering it was dug from both ends and met in the middle. An inscription found inside, known as the Siloam inscription, describes the emotional moment when the two teams of diggers finally met, hearing each other's voices and digging toward the sound until their pickaxes broke through. This tunnel ensured that Jerusalem would have fresh water even during a prolonged siege, a crucial preparation for the coming war. In addition to physical preparations, Hezekiah also sought political alliances. In chapter 18, verse 21, we see a reference to his alliance with Egypt when the Assyrian official taunts him, "On what are you basing this confidence of yours? You say you have counsel and might for war, but you speak only empty words. On whom are you depending, that you rebel against me? Look, I see you are depending on Egypt, that splintered reed of a staff, which pierces the hand of anyone who leans on it." This alliance with Egypt was part of Hezekiah's anti-Assyrian strategy. He knew that Judah alone did not have the military strength to resist the mighty Assyrian army, so he sought support from another major regional power. This diplomatic move reflected Hezekiah's political acumen. He used every means at his disposal: religious reform, military preparations, and international alliances to protect his people. However, these preparations were not enough to halt the Assyrian invasion. When Sennacherib attacked, he quickly captured most of Judah's territory. In verse 14, we see Hezekiah attempting a diplomatic solution. So Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent this message to the king of Assyria at Lachish: "I have done wrong. Withdraw from me, and I will pay whatever you demand of me." The king of Assyria exacted from Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. To pay this enormous tribute, Hezekiah had to use all available resources. Verses 15 and 16 state, "So Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasuries of the royal palace. At this time Hezekiah stripped the gold with which he had covered the doors and doorposts of the temple of the Lord and gave it to the king of Assyria." This desperate act shows how serious the Assyrian threat was. Hezekiah was forced to strip the very temple he had purified and restored just to try to appease the invader. But as we will see, even this huge payment was not enough to remove the danger. Despite the heavy tribute payment, Sennacherib was not satisfied. He sent 3 of his top officials with a large army from Lachish to Jerusalem to demand the city's complete surrender. In verse 17 we read, "The king of Assyria sent his supreme commander, his chief officer, and his field commander with a great army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. They came up to Jerusalem and stopped at the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the washerman's field." The choice of this location for the confrontation was not accidental. The aqueduct of the upper pool was part of the water system that Hezekiah had built to fortify the city. The Assyrian officials positioned themselves there as a symbolic threat to cut off Jerusalem's water supply, the very project on which Hezekiah was relying for survival in a siege. The Assyrians summoned the king, but Hezekiah did not go out to them personally. In verse 18, we read, "They called for the king, and Eliakim son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, Shebna the secretary, and Joah son of Asaph the recorder went out to them." Then the Assyrian field commander began to deliver a message, a carefully crafted piece of psychological warfare designed to demoralize the defenders of Jerusalem. He spoke loudly in Hebrew, not Aramaic, the diplomatic language of the day, so that all the people on the city wall could understand. His goal was clear: to destroy the people's confidence in Hezekiah and in God, and thus force a surrender without the need for a prolonged siege. In verses 19 and 20, he directly questioned Hezekiah's strategy. The field commander said to them, "Tell Hezekiah, this is what the great king, the king of Assyria, says. On what are you basing this confidence of yours? You say you have strategy and military strength, but you speak only empty words. On whom are you depending that you rebel against me?" He then attacked each pillar of Judah's confidence: the alliance with Egypt, Hezekiah's religious reforms, and finally, the God of Israel himself. In verses 22 to 25, he argued, "But if you say to me, 'We are depending on the Lord our God,' isn't he the one whose high places and altars Hezekiah removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, 'You must worship before this altar in Jerusalem'? Come now, make a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria. I will give you 2,000 horses, if you can put riders on them. How then can you repulse one officer of the least of my master's officials, even though you are depending on Egypt for chariots and horsemen? Furthermore, have I come to attack and destroy this place without a word from the Lord? The Lord himself told me to march against this country and destroy it." This last argument was particularly insidious. The Assyrian official claimed that the God of Israel himself had sent the Assyrians to destroy Jerusalem. This was a direct attempt to undermine the people's faith in the very God whom Hezekiah had restored as the center of national life. Hezekiah's representatives recognized the danger these words posed to the morale of the people. In verse 26, they pleaded, "Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, since we understand it. Don't speak to us in Hebrew in the hearing of the people on the wall." But this request only confirmed to the Assyrian official that his tactics were working. In verse 27, he retorted, "Was it only to your master and to you that my master sent me to say these things, and not to the people sitting on the wall, who, like you, will have to eat their own excrement and drink their own urine?" Then he continued his speech in an even louder voice, addressing the people on the wall directly. In verses 28 to 35, the high-ranking official made a direct appeal to the people of Jerusalem, telling them not to trust Hezekiah or his God. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot deliver you from my hand. Do not let Hezekiah persuade you to trust in the Lord. Do not listen to Hezekiah. This is what the king of Assyria says. Make peace with me and come out to me. Then each of you will eat fruit from your own vine and fig tree and drink water from your own cistern until I come and take you to a land like your own, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey. Choose life and not death. This speech was a masterful combination of threats, false promises, and attempts to subvert religious faith. It was a classic example of psychological warfare, intended to defeat Jerusalem not by military force, but by fear and demoralization. However, the people's response was remarkable. In verse 36, we read, "But the people remained silent and said nothing in reply, because the king had commanded, 'Do not answer him.'" This disciplined silence demonstrated the people's loyalty to Hezekiah and their refusal to give in to Assyrian propaganda. But the challenge had been laid down, and now Hezekiah and his people faced the critical decision of whether to surrender or resist the seemingly invincible Assyrian war machine. When Hezekiah's officials returned and reported the words of the high-ranking official, the king responded with humility and faith. In chapter 19, verse 1, we read, "When King Hezekiah heard this, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and went into the temple of the Lord." Tearing his clothes and putting on sackcloth were traditional signs of grief, mourning, and repentance in Israel. Hezekiah recognized the gravity of the situation and humbled himself before God. He did not rely on his own strategies or the political alliances he had made. He sought help in the temple, the very place he had restored as the center of true worship in Judah. King Hezekiah also sent an official delegation to the prophet Isaiah. In verse 2, we read, "He sent Eliakim, the palace administrator, Shebna, the secretary, and the leading priests, all wearing sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz." The fact that they were all wearing sackcloth shows that the entire leadership of Judah shared the same spirit of humility and desperation. The message Hezekiah sent to Isaiah revealed both his distress and his hope. In verses 3 and 4, he said, "This is what Hezekiah says. This day is a day of distress and rebuke and disgrace, as when children come to the moment of birth and there is no strength to deliver them. It may be that the Lord your God will hear all the words of the field commander, whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to ridicule the living God, and that he will rebuke him for the words the Lord your God has heard. Therefore pray for the remnant that still survives." Hezekiah acknowledged that the situation was desperate. They were like a woman in labor with no strength to give birth. But he also expressed hope that God would hear the blasphemous words of the Assyrians and act to defend his own honor. His primary concern was not for himself, but for the remnant that still survives, the small portion of Judah not yet under Assyrian control. Isaiah's response was immediate and reassuring. In verses 5 to 7 we read, "When King Hezekiah's officials came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, 'Tell your master, this is what the Lord says. Do not be afraid of what you have heard. Those words with which the underlings of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Listen, I am going to put such a spirit in him that when he hears a certain report, he will return to his own country, and there I will have him cut down with the sword.'" This divine promise must have brought immense relief to Hezekiah. God had heard his prayer and responded through the prophet, assuring him that the Assyrians would not succeed and that Sennacherib himself would meet a disastrous end. Meanwhile, the situation on the battlefield was shifting. The Assyrian commander returned to Sennacherib and found him fighting against the city of Libnah, having left Lachish. News came that Tirhakah, the king of Cush, Ethiopia, was marching out to fight the Assyrians. This military movement forced Sennacherib to reconsider his campaign in Judah. But before withdrawing, Sennacherib sent messengers with a letter to Hezekiah, renewing his threats. In verses 10 to 13, he wrote, "Do not let the God you depend on deceive you when he says, 'Jerusalem will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria.' Surely you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the countries, destroying them completely. And will you be delivered? Did the gods of the nations that were destroyed by my predecessors deliver them? The gods of Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden who were in Tel Assar? Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, the king of the city of Sepharvaim, or of Hena, or Ivah?" This letter was yet another direct challenge, not just to Hezekiah, but to the God of Israel himself. Sennacherib lumped the Lord of Israel into the same category as the powerless gods of conquered nations, implying that he too was unable to save Jerusalem. Hezekiah's response was exemplary. In verse 14 we read, "Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it. Then he went up to the temple of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord." This symbolic act demonstrated Hezekiah's complete dependence on God. He literally laid the problem before the Lord. Then Hezekiah offered one of the most beautiful and theologically profound prayers in the Bible. In verses 15 to 19 he prayed, and Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, "Lord, the God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Give ear, Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, Lord, and see. Listen to the words Sennacherib has sent to ridicule the living God. It is true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste these nations and their lands. They have thrown their gods into the fire and destroyed them, for they were not gods but only wood and stone, fashioned by human hands. Now, Lord our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God." This prayer reveals Hezekiah's mature faith. He acknowledged the true nature of God as the creator and sole ruler of the entire earth. He acknowledged the reality of the Assyrian conquests and even agreed that the other gods could not save their nations. But he made it clear that this was because they were not true gods, but only man-made idols. The answer to Hezekiah's prayer came swiftly through the prophet Isaiah. In verse 20 we read, "Then Isaiah son of Amoz sent a message to Hezekiah. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I have heard your prayer concerning Sennacherib, king of Assyria." Isaiah then delivered a long divine message in which God mocked Sennacherib's arrogance and affirmed his own sovereignty over all nations, including Assyria. In verses 21 to 28, God spoke of Jerusalem, personified as the virgin daughter of Zion, who scorned and mocked Sennacherib. "Whom have you ridiculed and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes in pride? Against the Holy One of Israel." God confronted Sennacherib's pride. He had boasted of his military conquests as if they were achieved by his own strength alone. But in verses 25 and 26, God declared, "Have you not heard? Long ago I ordained it. In days of old I planned it. Now I have brought it to pass." Their people, drained of power, are dismayed and put to shame. They are like plants in the field, like tender green shoots, like grass sprouting on the roof, scorched before it grows up. God made it clear to the Assyrian king that all his victories had happened because God had allowed them. Sennacherib was merely a tool in the divine hand, used to accomplish greater purposes. Then in verses 29 to 31, God gave a sign to Hezekiah and the people of Judah. That year they would eat what grew by itself, and the second year what sprang from that. It would not be until the third year that they would sow and reap, plant vineyards, and eat their fruit. This sign promised not only immediate survival, but also the restoration of normal life, as the people would once again work their land in peace. The Lord's promise culminated in verses 32 to 34 with a specific guarantee of Jerusalem's deliverance. Therefore, this is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, he will return. He will not enter this city, declares the Lord. I will defend this city and save it, for my sake and for the sake of David, my servant. This promise was clear and decisive. Jerusalem would be spared. Not a single Assyrian soldier would enter the city. No arrows would be shot. No siege ramps built. God would defend Jerusalem, not because of the people's merit, but to preserve his own honor and fulfill his promise to David. And then the promise was miraculously fulfilled. In verse 35 we read, "That night the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies." This extraordinary event completely transformed the situation. In a single night, without a battle, the mighty army of Assyria was decimated. 185,000 soldiers dead, not by the sword of man, but by the angel of the Lord, an invisible agent of divine judgment. Some theories suggest a plague or disease may have spread rapidly through the camp, but the biblical text is clear that the event was a direct intervention of God. Sennacherib's reaction was immediate. In verse 36 we read, "So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there." The great conqueror who had subdued so many nations and boasted of his power was forced to retreat in humiliation, having never captured Jerusalem. Sennacherib's end was as tragic as his defeat before Jerusalem. Verse 37 tells us, "One day while he was worshiping in the temple of his god Nisroch, his sons Adramelech and Sharezer killed him with the sword, and they escaped to the land of Ararat, and Esarhaddon, his son, succeeded him as king." His death at the hands of his own sons fulfilled Isaiah's earlier prophecy. "I will put a spirit in him. He will return to his own country, and there I will have him cut down with the sword." 2 Kings 19:7. The mighty king who had threatened so many nations did not die in glorious battle, but was treacherously assassinated while worshiping his false god. The miraculous deliverance of Jerusalem remained in the memory of the people of Judah for generations. This divine intervention demonstrated God's care for those who trust in him and the futility of relying on human power, no matter how formidable it may seem. Shortly after the great victory over Assyria, a new crisis arose, this time affecting King Hezekiah personally. In chapter 20, verse 1, we read, "In those days Hezekiah became ill and was at the point of death. The prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, went to him and said, 'This is what the Lord says. Put your house in order because you are going to die. You will not recover.'" This news must have been devastating to Hezekiah. He had just experienced a great spiritual and military triumph, leading his people through one of the most severe crises in their history. Now, at the height of his leadership, he was told he was about to die. Hezekiah's response was immediate and emotional. In verse 2, we read that Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord. This posture reflected both the privacy and the intensity with which he sought God. His prayer was brief but heartfelt. "Remember, Lord, how I have walked before you faithfully and with wholehearted devotion, and have done what is good in your eyes." Verse 3. And then Hezekiah wept bitterly. The king's prayer touched the heart of God. Before Isaiah had even left the middle court of the palace, the Lord instructed him to return with a new message. In verses 5 and 6, God said, "Go back and tell Hezekiah, the ruler of my people, this is what the Lord, the God of your father David, says. I have heard your prayer and seen your tears. I will heal you. On the third day from now, you will go up to the temple of the Lord. I will add 15 years to your life, and I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria. I will defend this city for my sake and for the sake of my servant David." This response shows God's mercy and his willingness to listen to sincere prayer. He promised not only healing, but also a specific extension of life, 15 more years, and continued protection for Jerusalem from Assyria. To confirm this promise, God offered a miraculous sign. Isaiah asked Hezekiah, "Which shall it be, for the shadow to go forward 10 steps or to go back 10 steps?" Verse 9. This was likely referring to a type of sundial or staircase used to measure time by the position of a shadow. Hezekiah replied, "It is a simple matter for the shadow to go forward 10 steps. Rather, have it go back 10 steps. His choice reflected wisdom, as it would be far more remarkable to see time literally reverse itself than to advance, which it does naturally as the day progresses. In verse 11, we see this miraculous sign fulfilled. Then the prophet Isaiah called on the Lord, and the Lord made the shadow go back the 10 steps it had gone down on the stairway of Ahaz. This extraordinary miracle confirmed God's promise and solidified Hezekiah's faith in his recovery. The specific method of healing is also mentioned. In verse 7, Isaiah said, "Prepare a poultice of figs." When they did so and applied it to the boil, Hezekiah recovered. It is interesting to note that God used a natural remedy, a poultice of figs, in conjunction with his supernatural intervention. Both medicine and miracles played a role in the healing process. This episode in Hezekiah's life reveals several important spiritual truths: God's willingness to listen to heartfelt prayer, the possibility that his decrees can be altered in response to such prayer, and his compassion for those who serve him faithfully. It also highlights Hezekiah's humility. Despite being a powerful king, he did not hesitate to cry out to God in his distress. News of Hezekiah's illness and miraculous recovery spread beyond the borders of Judah. In verse 12, we read, "At that time Marduk-Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and a gift, because he had heard of Hezekiah's illness and recovery." This diplomatic contact from Babylon was significant for several reasons. Babylon was not yet the superpower it would later become, but it was already a major player in Middle Eastern politics. At that time, Babylon was trying to strengthen its position against Assyria by seeking potential allies who shared the goal of weakening Assyrian power. For Hezekiah, receiving this delegation must have been deeply gratifying. After years of being threatened and humiliated by Assyria, he was now being recognized and courted by another significant power. It was a sign that his international standing had improved dramatically. Unfortunately, Hezekiah failed to discern the true motives behind this diplomatic mission. The Babylonian envoys were likely more interested in assessing Judah's wealth and military resources than in expressing sympathy for the king's recovery. Naively, Hezekiah gave them full access to his kingdom. In verse 13 we read, "Hezekiah received the envoys and showed them all that was in his storehouses, the silver, the gold, the spices, and the fine olive oil, his armory and everything found in his treasuries. There was nothing in his palace or in all his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them." This was a serious diplomatic blunder. By revealing all his resources, Hezekiah exposed both his wealth and his potential military weaknesses. In a world where information was power, he handed strategic advantages to a kingdom that would later become Judah's mortal enemy. The prophet Isaiah quickly recognized the mistake and came to question the king. In verse 14 he asked, "What did those men say, and from where did they come?" Hezekiah replied, "From a distant land, from Babylon." Then Isaiah asked, "What did they see in your palace?" And Hezekiah admitted, "They saw everything in my palace. There is nothing among my treasures that I did not show them." Isaiah's response was solemn and prophetic. In verses 16 to 18, he said, "Hear the word of the Lord. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." This prophecy was both tragic and far-reaching. The very treasures that Hezekiah had proudly displayed to the Babylonians would one day be taken by those same Babylonians, and the royal sons of Judah would not reign as kings in Jerusalem, but would serve as eunuchs in the Babylonian Embark court. Hezekiah's response in verse 19 is surprising and has been interpreted in different ways. "The word of the Lord you have spoken is good," Hezekiah replied, for he thought, "Will there not be peace and security in my lifetime?" Some see this response as callously selfish. Hezekiah cared little about what would happen after his death, as long as he could enjoy peace during his own lifetime. Others interpret his words as a humble acceptance of God's judgment, acknowledging that the sentence could have been much worse and could have fallen upon himself. Regardless of the correct interpretation, it is clear that Hezekiah accepted the prophecy without protest. This final episode reveals a crucial aspect of human nature. Even the best leaders can make mistakes in judgment. Hezekiah, who had shown great faith and courage in the face of the Assyrian threat, now showed naivety and perhaps even pride in the face of Babylonian flattery. The Bible presents its heroes in their fullness, without hiding their flaws, reminding us that even great men and women of faith are ultimately human. Isaiah's prophecy of the Babylonian exile would begin to be fulfilled about a century later, when Nebuchadnezzar took the first exiles from Judah to Babylon. Among them were Daniel and his friends, young men of the royal line who served in the Babylonian court, just as Isaiah had prophesied. When Hezekiah died, having completed the additional 15 years God had given him, his son Manasseh took the throne. Unfortunately, Manasseh did not follow his father's example. He reversed many of Hezekiah's religious reforms and led Judah back into idolatry, deepening the cycle of revival and decay that marked the kingdom's history. Nevertheless, Hezekiah's reign remains one of the high points in Judah's story, a time of spiritual renewal, political independence, and divine protection that showed what was possible when a king and his people chose to walk wholeheartedly in the ways of the Lord. After the death of the faithful King Hezekiah, his son Manasseh became king of Judah. In 2 Kings 21, we see that he was very young when he began his reign. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. 2 Kings 21:1. This long reign of over half a century was marked by a horrific reversal of the reforms his father had implemented. Unlike Hezekiah, who served the Lord with all his heart, Manasseh chose a completely different path. Verse 2 leaves no doubt about his conduct. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. Manasseh not only ignored his father's good example, but actively worked to undo everything Hezekiah had done. Verse 3 describes his actions. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He also erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. But the young king did not stop at building pagan altars on the high places outside the city. He brought idolatry into the sacred temple itself. In verses 4 and 5 we read, "He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, 'In Jerusalem I will put my name.' In the two courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all the starry hosts." His religious practices became increasingly extreme and abominable. Verse 6 reveals, "He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, arousing his anger." To complete his defilement of the temple, Manasseh placed an idol right in the holy place itself. Verse 7 records this sacrilegious act. He took the carved Asherah pole he had made and put it in the temple, of which the Lord had said to David and to his son Solomon, "In this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever." All these actions represented a complete rejection of the covenant God had made with the people of Israel. Manasseh's idolatry was not just a religious matter. It struck at the very foundation of Judah's national identity as God's chosen people. On top of all this, Manasseh was also known for his cruelty. In verse 16 we read, "Moreover, Manasseh also shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from one end to the other, besides the sin that he had caused Judah to commit, so that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord." The phrase "shed innocent blood" likely refers to the persecution and execution of faithful worshippers of the Lord, including the prophets who spoke out against his actions. An ancient Jewish tradition not recorded in the Bible holds that the prophet Isaiah was killed during this period, sawn in two at Manasseh's command. God's response to these abominations came through his prophets, whose words are recorded in verses 10 to 15. The Lord declared that because of Manasseh's sins, he would bring such a disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of anyone who heard it would tingle. God promised to wipe over Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. Manasseh's actions sealed Judah's fate. Although later kings would attempt reform, the spiritual damage caused by this long and apostate reign was irreparable. Verse 9 summarizes the impact of his influence. Manasseh led them astray, so that they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. The book of 2 Kings does not mention Manasseh's repentance, but this part of the story is told in the book of 2 Chronicles. In chapter 33 of that book, we see that the consequences of Manasseh's sin came swiftly. Verse 11 reads, "So the Lord brought against them the army commanders of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh prisoner, put a hook in his nose, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon." This humiliating capture marked a turning point in Manasseh's life. Taken as a prisoner to Babylon, which was at that time under Assyrian control, he finally faced the consequences of his rebellion against God. The hook mentioned in the text likely refers to a metal ring inserted into the nose or lips of a prisoner, by which they were led with a rope, a typical Assyrian method of humiliating conquered kings. In his deep distress, Manasseh finally turned to the God he had abandoned. Verse 12 describes this change of heart. In his distress, he sought the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his ancestors. Amazingly, God heard his prayer. Verse 13 recounts, "And when he prayed to him, the Lord was moved by his entreaty and listened to his plea. So he brought him back to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord is God." After returning to the throne in Jerusalem, Manasseh tried to undo some of the damage he had caused. He removed the foreign gods and the idol from the temple, tore down the altars he had built, and restored the altar of the Lord, offering fellowship and thank offerings. Verse 16 recounts, "Then he restored the altar of the Lord and sacrificed fellowship offerings and thank offerings on it, and told Judah to serve the Lord, the God of Israel." However, despite these late efforts, the spiritual damage was done. Verse 17 notes, "The people, however, continued to sacrifice at the high places, but only to the Lord their God." When Manasseh died, his son Amon became king and quickly returned to the path of idolatry. In 2 Kings 21:20 we read, "He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, as his father Manasseh had done. He followed completely the ways of his father, worshiping the idols his father had worshipped and bowing down to them." Amon's reign was short, only 2 years before he was assassinated by his own officials. Manasseh's repentance, though sincere, it came too late to change the course he had set for his kingdom. His long and wicked reign had shaped a generation of idolaters, and his brief reform at the end of his life was not enough to reverse that influence. The story of Manasseh shows that while God is always willing to forgive a repentant sinner, the consequences of our actions often remain. The personal forgiveness Manasseh received did not erase the national judgment his leadership had brought upon Judah. After the short and wicked reign of Amon, his son Josiah took the throne. In 2 Kings 22:1 we read, Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. This young boy who ascended the throne at such a tender age would become one of Judah's most remarkable religious reformers. Unlike his father and grandfather, Josiah chose to follow the path of David. Verse 2 says, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and followed completely the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. In the 18th year of his reign, when Josiah was 26, he initiated a project to renovate the temple, which had been neglected during the preceding reigns. In verses 3-7, we see him sending his secretary, Shaphan, to the temple to oversee the repairs with the money that had been collected for this purpose. During the restoration, an extraordinary discovery was made. Verse 8 recounts, Hezekiah the high priest said to Shaphan, the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord. He gave it to Shaphan, who read it. This book of the law was likely a copy of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, or at least the book of Deuteronomy. During the long years of apostasy under Manasseh and Amon, God's law had been so forgotten that even this foundational text had been lost within the temple. When Shaphan returned to the king, he reported on the repairs and then said, Hezekiah the priest has given me a book, and Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. Josiah's reaction was dramatic. In verse 11 we read, when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. This act of tearing his clothes was a cultural expression of extreme grief and distress. Josiah was horrified to realize how far his people had strayed from God's commands. Immediately, the king ordered his officials to inquire of the Lord about the meaning of the book for them. Go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the people, and for all Judah about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because those who have gone before us have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us. The officials went to consult the prophetess Huldah, who lived in Jerusalem. Her response, recorded in verses 15-17, confirmed Josiah's fears. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the man who sent you to me, this is what the Lord says. I am going to bring disaster on this place and its people, according to everything written in the book the king of Judah has read. However, because of Josiah's humble response, God also sent a personal word of comfort to the king. In verses 19-20, the prophetess declared, because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before the Lord, I will gather you to your ancestors, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I am going to bring on this place. Strengthened by this prophecy, Josiah redoubled his reform efforts. In chapter 23, we see that he gathered all the leaders and people of Judah at the temple, where he read to them the entire book of the covenant. He then made a covenant before the Lord, pledging to follow the Lord and keep his commands. All the people pledged themselves to the covenant. Josiah then launched a tireless campaign to purge Judah of idolatry. He removed all idolatrous objects from the temple, deposed pagan priests, destroyed the high places, and demolished altars, Asherah poles, and every symbol of false worship. His reform was the most extensive and thorough since the time of David. In verses 24 and 25, we read a powerful summary of his actions. Furthermore, Josiah got rid of the mediums and spiritists, the household gods, the idols, and all the other detestable things seen in Judah and Jerusalem. This he did to fulfill the requirements of the law written in the book that Hilkiah the priest had discovered in the temple of the Lord. Neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to the Lord as he did, with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength, in accordance with all the law of Moses. The discovery of the book of the law and Josiah's obedient response marked the last great spiritual revival in Judah before the exile. It was a moment of returning to the roots of the faith and renewing the covenant with God. One of Josiah's most remarkable achievements was the celebration of an extraordinary Passover, one that surpassed any held since the time of the judges. In chapter 23, verse 21, we read the king's command. The king gave this order to all the people: "Celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant." This was not to be a routine ceremony. It was a return to the exact observance of the law of Moses. Verses 22 and 23 emphasize the uniqueness of this Passover. Not since the days of the judges who led Israel, nor throughout the reigns of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, had any such Passover been observed. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was celebrated to the Lord in Jerusalem. What made this Passover so special? In 2 Chronicles 35, we find more details. Josiah personally provided from his own flocks 30,000 lambs and young goats for the Passover offerings, along with 3,000 cattle. His officials also voluntarily contributed animals for the people, priests and Levites. The priests and Levites prepared the ceremony, and all the proceedings were conducted in strict accordance with the law of Moses. The Levites slaughtered the Passover lambs, set apart the consecrated portions, and distributed them quickly so that everyone could participate. In 2 Chronicles 35:18, we read again, "The Passover had not been observed like this in Israel since the days of the prophet Samuel. And none of the kings of Israel had ever celebrated such a Passover as did Josiah, with the priests, the Levites, and all Judah and Israel who were there with the people of Jerusalem." This special Passover was significant because it marked a return to Israel's historical roots. The Passover commemorated the nation's deliverance from slavery in Egypt, their founding event. By restoring this celebration in its purity, Josiah reminded the people of who they truly were, the people chosen by God, rescued from bondage to serve him. This extraordinary Passover also symbolized the renewal of the covenant between God and his people. By participating in this ancient ritual, the people reaffirmed their commitment to God's commands and their identity as his special people. The Bible emphasizes that no Passover like this had occurred since the time of the judges, not even during the reigns of David or Solomon, highlighting the purity and faithfulness to the law with which this ceremony was conducted. Josiah did not improvise or modernize the ritual. He meticulously followed the original instructions of Moses. Sadly, despite this faithful return under Josiah's leadership, the heart of the people of Judah had not truly changed. In 2 Kings chapter 23, 26-27, we read, "Nevertheless, the Lord did not turn away from the heat of his fierce anger, which burned against Judah because of all that Manasseh had done to arouse his anger. So the Lord said, I will remove Judah also from my presence, as I removed Israel, and I will reject Jerusalem, the city I chose, and this temple, about which I said, my name shall be there." Josiah's reform, though sincere and far-reaching, came too late to change the course of Judah's history. God's judgment was already set. Nevertheless, this extraordinary Passover remains a powerful testament to what is possible when God's people sincerely and obediently turn to his word. Despite his faithfulness to God, Josiah met a tragic and premature end on the battlefield. In chapter 23, verse 29, we read, "While Josiah was king, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the Euphrates River to help the king of Assyria. King Josiah marched out to meet him in battle, but Necho faced him and killed him at Megiddo. This brief passage conceals a more complex story. The broader historical context was the decline of the Assyrian Empire and the rise of Babylon. The king of Assyria was under attack from the Babylonians, and Pharaoh Necho was marching to his aid. This Egyptian-Assyrian alliance was not in Judah's interest. Since the country had long suffered under Assyrian oppression, Josiah decided to intercept the Egyptian army at Megiddo, a strategically located city on a narrow pass where the Carmel mountain range meets the hills of Galilee. It was a natural bottleneck on the main route connecting Egypt and Mesopotamia. In 2 Chronicles 35, we find more details about this fateful encounter. Pharaoh Necho sent messengers to Josiah saying, "What quarrel is there, king of Judah, between you and me? It is not you I am attacking at this time, but the house with which I am at war. God has told me to hurry, so stop opposing God, who is with me, or he will destroy you." Surprisingly, the text tells us that these words did indeed come from God, but Josiah did not recognize them. Instead of backing down, he disguised himself and went into battle, ignoring the divine warning. During the confrontation, Egyptian archers struck King Josiah, and he said to his officers, "Take me away, I am badly wounded." They took him out of his chariot, put him in another, and brought him to Jerusalem, where he died. He was buried in the tombs of his ancestors, and all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for him. The death of Josiah at Megiddo marked a turning point in Judah's history. With him died the last real hope for genuine reform. His son, Jehoahaz, who succeeded him, did not follow his righteous path, and within months, Judah fell under Egyptian domination. The prophet Jeremiah composed laments for Josiah, and all the male and female singers continued to speak of Josiah in their laments to this day. The untimely death of this faithful king was a national tragedy and a prelude to greater disasters to come. The irony of this story is that Josiah, who had been so meticulous in following God's law in religious matters, seems to have failed to seek God's guidance in this crucial military decision. His decision to oppose Egypt, though perhaps politically understandable, went against the specific direction God had given through the Pharaoh. His death is a solemn reminder that even the most faithful servants of God are not immune to errors in judgment with tragic consequences. After Josiah's death, Judah entered a period of rapid decline under a series of kings who were little more than puppets of foreign powers. The first of these was Jehoahaz, Josiah's son. In 2 Kings 23:31 we read, "Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His reign was short and unrighteous, as he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his ancestors had done." Jehoahaz's control over Judah ended quickly when Pharaoh Necho captured him and took him to Egypt, where he later died. Verse 33 records, "Pharaoh Necho put him in chains at Riblah, in the land of Hamath, so that he might not reign in Jerusalem. And he imposed on Judah a levy of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold." To replace him, Necho installed another of Josiah's sons, changing his name from Eliakim to Jehoiakim, a symbolic gesture of the Pharaoh's power over the new king. Verse 35 shows how subservient Jehoiakim was to Egypt. Jehoiakim paid Pharaoh Necho the silver and gold he demanded. In order to do so, he taxed the land and exacted the silver and gold from the people of the land according to their assessments. Jehoiakim reigned for 11 years, and, like his brother, did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his ancestors had done. During his reign, the power structure in the region shifted dramatically. In chapter 24, verse 1, we see that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, rose to power, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. But then he changed his mind and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. This rebellion proved to be a fatal mistake. Nebuchadnezzar sent raiding parties from Babylon, Aram, Moab, and Ammon to destroy Judah, just as the Lord had foretold through his prophets. After Jehoiakim's death, his son Jehoiachin, also known as Jeconiah, became king. In verse 8 we read, Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His short reign coincided with the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem. Soon he surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar, who took him captive to Babylon along with the queen mother, his officials, and many of Judah's nobles and skilled artisans. The last king of Judah was Zedekiah, Jehoiachin's uncle, who was placed on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar as a vassal. Verse 18 states, Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. Like his predecessors, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as Jehoiakim had done. Despite being a vassal of Babylon, Zedekiah eventually succumbed to political pressure to rebel. Verse 20 tells us that it was because of the Lord's anger that all this happened to Jerusalem and Judah, and in the end he thrust them from his presence. Now Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. This succession of puppet kings, Jehoahaz under Egypt, Jehoiakim and Zedekiah under Babylon, demonstrates the degradation of the Davidic monarchy. Once independent rulers leading a nation in covenant with God, the kings of Judah had become instruments of foreign powers, unable to shape their own destiny. Moreover, none of these final kings showed the faithfulness to God that Josiah had. Instead of learning from the tragedy that was befalling their kingdom, they continued in the very sins that had brought God's judgment. The cycle of idolatry, injustice, and rebellion against God that had marked so much of the monarchy's history continued to its bitter end. The fall of Jerusalem did not happen all at once, but in 3 distinct phases or waves, each more devastating than the last. This gradual process offered the people multiple opportunities to repent, opportunities they sadly ignored. The first phase occurred during the reign of Jehoiakim, around 605 BC. Although 2 Kings does not provide many details about this event, we know from Jeremiah and Daniel that during this initial campaign, Nebuchadnezzar carried off some of the temple treasures and a select group of young men from the Jewish nobility to Babylon, including Daniel and his friends. The second, more severe phase occurred in 597 BC during the short reign of Jehoiachin. In chapter 24, verses 10 to 16, we read that Nebuchadnezzar himself came to Jerusalem, and Jehoiachin surrendered. The Babylonian king carried off all the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasuries of the royal palace. As the Lord had declared, Nebuchadnezzar removed all the gold articles that Solomon, king of Israel, had made for the temple of the Lord. In addition to the material wealth, Nebuchadnezzar deported the elite of Jewish society. He carried into exile all Jerusalem, all the officers and fighting men, and all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. King Jehoiachin, the queen mother, his wives, his officials, and the leading men of the land were all taken captive from Judah to Babylon. There were also 7,000 soldiers and 1,000 artisans and craftsmen, all strong and fit for war. This mass deportation left Judah severely weakened, deprived of its leadership and technical skills. The only ones left were the poorest of the land, who could hardly mount any significant resistance. The third and most devastating phase took place in 586 BC, after Zedekiah's rebellion. In chapter 25, we read that Nebuchadnezzar returned with his entire army and laid siege to Jerusalem. In verse 1, the text gives us the exact date. In the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The siege was long and terrible. In verses 2 and 3 we read, The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people of the land. This means the siege lasted about a year and a half, during which time the famine inside the city became unbearable. Finally, the city fell. A breach was made in the city wall, and all the soldiers fled by night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the city was surrounded by the Babylonians. They fled toward the Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers deserted him. Zedekiah's punishment was brutal. In chapter 25, verse 7, we see the horrific fate of Judah's last king. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. This punishment was typical of Babylonian cruelty, calculated and deliberate. Forcing Zedekiah to watch the execution of his sons ensured that his last sight would be the most horrific imaginable. Then, by blinding him, the Babylonians ensured that this nightmare would be permanently etched in his memory, never to be replaced by any new image. With the king captured, all organized resistance ended, and the Babylonians were free to complete the destruction of Jerusalem. In verse 8 we read, "On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan oversaw the complete demolition of the city." In verses 9 and 10, we see the extent of the destruction. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses in Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls surrounding Jerusalem. This was a moment of unspeakable tragedy for the people of Judah. The temple built by Solomon, the center of worship for nearly 400 years, was utterly destroyed. The royal palace, a symbol of the Davidic dynasty, was burned to the ground. The walls that had once protected the city were torn down, leaving it permanently vulnerable. Nebuzaradan then deported the rest of the population. He carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with those who had deserted to the king of Babylon and the rest of the population. Only the poorest were left behind to work as farmers and vine dressers. The Babylonians also carried off all the remaining valuables from the temple, including the bronze pillars, the movable stands, and the large bronze basin that had been in the temple. They also took away the utensils used in the temple, such as the bowls, shovels, wick trimmers, dishes, and all the bronze articles. Verse 15 adds, "The commander of the guard also took away the censers and sprinkling bowls, all that were made of pure gold or silver. The bronze from the two pillars, the sea and the movable stands, which Solomon had made for the temple of the Lord, was more than could be weighed. Each pillar was 18 cubits high, and the bronze capital on top was decorated with a network of interwoven chains and pomegranates, all of bronze. The second pillar was identical to the first." The Babylonians also executed the remaining leaders of Judah. Nebuzaradan captured Seraiah the chief priest, Zephaniah the priest next in rank, and the 3 doorkeepers. He also captured the army officer in charge of the soldiers, 5 royal advisors, the chief officer in charge of conscripting the people of the land, and 60 other men who were still in the city. They were all taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where they were executed. Thus, verses 20 and 21 solemnly conclude this section. "So Judah went into captivity away from her land. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, appointed Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, over the people he had left behind in Judah." These 3 waves of invasion and deportation fulfilled the prophecies God had long spoken through his prophets. The great nation established by David and consolidated by Solomon had come to an end in its land. The temple was destroyed, the royal line was broken, and the people were scattered. God's covenant with David seemed to be in crisis, and many wondered if his promises had failed. After the destruction of Jerusalem and the deportation of most of its inhabitants, only a small remnant of the poorest people remained in the land. To govern them, Nebuchadnezzar appointed Gedaliah, a Jew from a noble family who had apparently advocated for surrender to the Babylonians. In chapter 25, verse 22, we read of his appointment. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, appointed Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, over the people he had left behind in Judah. Gedaliah established his headquarters at Mizpah, a town a few miles north of Jerusalem. He adopted a policy of reconciliation and encouraged the people to submit to Babylonian rule. In verse 24, we see his advice to the Jews. Gedaliah took an oath to reassure them and their men. "Do not be afraid of the Babylonian officials," he said. "Settle down in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it will go well with you." For a brief moment, it seemed that a minimal degree of stability might return to the devastated land of Judah. Many Jews who had fled to neighboring lands during the war began to return. In verse 23, we read, "When all the army officers and their men heard that the king of Babylon had appointed Gedaliah as governor, they came to him at Mizpah. Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, Johanan, son of Kareah, Sariah, son of Tanhumeth, the Netophathite, and Jazaniah, son of the Maacathite, and their men. However, this period of peace was short-lived. In the 7th month, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, a member of the royal family, came with 10 men and assassinated Gedaliah. Verse 25 describes this treacherous act. But in the 7th month, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, the son of Elishama, who was of royal blood, came with 10 men and assassinated Gedaliah, and also the men of Judah and the Babylonians who were with him at Mizpah. This assassination was likely motivated by nationalist resentment against Gedaliah's policy of cooperation, or perhaps by Ishmael's personal ambition to restore the Davidic monarchy. Whatever the motive, the result was disastrous for the remnant in Judah. Verse 26 shows the immediate aftermath. At this, all the people from the least to the greatest, together with the army officers, fled to Egypt for fear of the Babylonians. This flight to Egypt was symbolic of a return to the very slavery from which their ancestors had escaped under Moses' leadership. The cycle was now complete. The people who had been delivered from Egypt to worship God in the Promised Land were now fleeing that land back to Egypt. The prophet Jeremiah, who was still alive at this time, strongly opposed this move to Egypt. He warned the people that they should stay in the land and submit to Babylonian rule as God had commanded. But the people would not listen to the prophet's voice. Instead, they forced Jeremiah himself to accompany them to Egypt, where, according to tradition, he was eventually martyred. With this flight to Egypt, the story of Judah as an independent political entity comes to an end. The land promised to Abraham, conquered by Joshua, unified by David, and glorified by Solomon, was now nearly desolate, its cities in ruins and its temple destroyed. However, the book of 2 Kings ends with a glimmer of hope. In verses 27 to 30, we read of an act of mercy toward the captive king Jehoiachin. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the year Evil-Merodach became king of Babylon, he released Jehoiachin from prison on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put aside his prison clothes and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day, the king gave Jehoiachin a regular allowance as long as he lived. This final note, though seemingly small, carries great theological and historical weight. Jehoiachin was a direct descendant of David, and his release from prison and restoration to a place of honor kept alive the hope that the Davidic line and the divine promises attached to it were not permanently terminated. For the exiled people of God, this news served as a reminder that even in the context of severe judgment, God had not completely abandoned his people or his promises. The Davidic dynasty survived, even if only as a king without a throne in a foreign court. And it was, in fact, through this very Davidic line, traced from Jehoiachin, that the Messiah would eventually come, fulfilling the ancient promise made to David that his throne would be established forever. So, even in the ashes of the kingdom of Judah, the first signs of hope and renewal could be seen. The time of judgment would be long, 70 years of exile, as the prophet Jeremiah had foretold, but it was not the end of God's story with his people. What an incredible journey we've just taken together through the book of 2 Kings. We've seen faithful and unfaithful kings, powerful prophets, astounding miracles, and ultimately, the fall of a kingdom that had strayed from its purpose. This story is so much more than ancient history. It speaks directly to us today. We've seen how leaders who trusted in God found guidance and protection, while those who followed their own path faced devastating consequences. We've seen the patience of God, sending prophet after prophet, offering chance after chance before judgment finally came. And even in the darkest moment, with Jerusalem in ruins and the people scattered, we saw that small glimmer of hope. A descendant of David, released from prison, keeping alive the promise that God had not abandoned his plan. If you've been moved or inspired by this journey through the second book of Kings, I want to invite you to become a part of our channel's community. Click that subscribe button right now so you don't miss out on our upcoming biblical explorations. Each week, we dive into a new story from Scripture, discovering together the treasures hidden in God's Word. And if this message has touched your heart, consider sharing this video with a friend or family member. Who knows how many people need to hear this very word of hope today? Your share could be the instrument God uses to bring encouragement to someone in need. Thank you so much for being with me on this journey. I look forward to seeing you in our next video for another incredible adventure through the pages of the Bible.